What's up guys, today I'm going to be reviewing Mark's $160 KevlaCarbon paddles, which is previously known as the Kinetic paddles. These specifically are the Mark 1, the Mark OneX, and the Mark 2. All three are good for their own reasons, but there's one in particular I've really enjoyed playing with, and that is the Mark OneX. And spoilers, if you are a tennis player or use two hands, you're going to want to stick around for it. Anyways, please consider subscribing if you enjoy, and let's jump into things. Starting with some of the specs on the paddles themselves. Okay, so I usually don't like to spend too much time around this area, but since there are three of them, I think it's kind of important to highlight the big differences between them. Starting with the Mark 1. So this is a 16mm flared hybrid shaped paddle with a focus that leans more towards the control game. It also has an average weight of 8.2 ounces and a handle length of 5.3 inches. Next up is the Mark OneX, probably my favorite out of the bunch that focuses on a mix between control and power. It has an average weight of 7.9 ounces and a handle length of 5.75 inches, one of the biggest selling points. And lastly, we have the Mark II, the most powerful out of the bunch, coming in at a weight of 8.1 ounces and a grip length of 5.5 inches. All three of these paddles use a blend of Kevlar and carbon fiber called KevlaCarbon, and they also use DuPont Kevlar, the same Kevlar as pretty much all the other Kevlar paddles out there, like the Ruby. They all also have a honeycomb core, are thermoformed, and are foam injected around the edges and handles to help with vibrations, which I actually think helps a lot. Not to mention that these paddles just look really good too. I especially like the checkered pattern it has on the surface from the KevlaCarbon. But anyways, now let's jump into the gameplay for each of the paddles. Starting with power. Alright, so all three of these paddles actually hit decently hard, but let's begin with the Mark 1. So like I mentioned earlier, this is the more control-focused paddle from the series. That said, compared to a lot of similar Kevlar paddles out there, like the Ruby or J2K, this is probably the strongest hitting out of that group. It's obviously not top tier, but if you want to rip drives with this, you can definitely do it. It doesn't spring off the face of it like a 14mm might, but the power is definitely there if you put in the effort. It also has a listed swing weight of 117.5, but it does feel a bit heavier than that at times. Still, for a 16mm control paddle, I'm fairly impressed with it. For sheer power, I would give it a 7 out of 10. Now, pop on the other hand is a pretty similar story. I think the pop on this is pretty good, but in my opinion, it plays fairly similar to a double black diamond. It doesn't necessarily fly off the paddle, but it does spring off a decent amount, enough to make your volleys or blocks a bit more threatening. For pop, I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10. The Mark OneX is also equally as powerful, if not a bit more powerful than the Mark 1, and I think that is solely due to the whippiness factor of it. Because it is a bit lighter and because it's balanced a bit differently due to the longer handle, I really feel like I'm able to comfortably and accurately crank balls with this thing, and not only that, but it also feels really good to hit with. I swear this paddle probably feels the most similar to a tennis racket out of any other paddle that I've tried so far. But anyways, for power, I would give it a 7.5 out of 10. The pop on this is also not too bad. I think it's slightly worse than the Mark 1, and I think that's probably because it inevitably dampens a bit with the longer handle, but still not terrible. I'd probably give it around a 6 out of 10. Anyways, lastly, we have the Mark II, definitely the most powerful out of the three. Even though this is a 16mm, this thing can hit hard, and it felt really good to play with as well. Drives felt incredibly smooth with this, so much so that I actually think I prefer drives with this more than any of the other paddles. It's not quite as strong as the 14mm power paddles, but for a 16mm, it really gives them a run for their money. Like, I felt like I could actually win some points just from drives with this paddle. Anyways, for straight power, I would probably give it an 8 out of 10. Pop on it is pretty solid too, especially when you hit the sweet spot. It doesn't come off as hard as the Mark 1, but the pop is definitely still there. Like, it still has plenty of pop to put balls away with flicks or volleys without having to get too aggressive. Overall, for pop on the Mark II, I would give it a 6 out of 10. All right, moving on to control. So honestly, all three of these paddles have really good control for the most part, but what's interesting is I found each of them to have a better control in specific areas. For example, as expected, the Mark 1 had the best control out of all of them in general. I especially felt comfortable with drops with this. Dinks felt solid too, like everything still felt pretty good, but drops specifically felt really good. It's honestly one of the more comfortable paddles that I've used so far for drops specifically. It has a lot of grab to it, and it feels pretty plush when you hit the ball too, but it's not so soft either that it takes away from your power game. I honestly think a lot has to do with it being weighted a bit heavier around the lower sides of the paddle along with the KevlaCarbon surface, but for control, I would give it a solid 7.5 out of 10. Mark OneX, on the other hand, felt really freaking good for dinks. Like, this is easily one of my favorite paddles I've used so far to dink with, and I feel like I have so much control at the net. When I use this paddle, I feel like I'm easily able to place it wherever I want in the kitchen and consistently win dink battles with it. I think this honestly has to do with the slightly longer handle and slightly smaller face, because it makes it feel a lot more comfortable and maneuverable. It isn't as clunky feeling as the elongated faced paddles, for instance. It's kind of hard to explain, but it just feels good to dink with. Drops, on the other hand, are okay though. I definitely found it to be a bit trickier to consistently reset balls with this paddle. I think I typically hit it too high when I miss with it, and it's probably because it's easy to overswing with this, but it's definitely manageable after practicing with it a bit. But overall, I would give it a 7 out of 10 for control. All right, and then we have the Mark II, which by far exceeded my expectations when it comes to control. I was pleasantly surprised at how well this thing performs in the soft game, especially for it being able to hit so hard. The dinking game wasn't bad with this. I didn't feel near as comfortable as the Mark I or Mark OneX, mostly because it is a bit clunkier due to its shape, but the drop game actually felt really good. Not quite as good as the Mark I, but it was still way closer than I ever expected, and still one of the better paddles for drops that I've used. Overall, I would honestly give this a 7 out of 10 as well. Okay, really quick with the sweet spots on these. So the sweet spot was also pretty good with all three of these. Overall, they felt decently big. The Mark I and the Mark OneX were pretty similar, but the Mark II wasn't quite as good as the others just because it had the longer face. But even in the non-sweet spot areas, I never felt like I hit a really bad dead spot. And I do think that the thermoforming and the foam injections actually helped a lot there. I'll also say that the Mark OneX already had a pretty good sweet spot, but it was still recommended specifically by Mark to add 3 grams of weight to the bottom corners. So I tested that out as well, and it did feel pretty good. I personally think that the standard paddle without the weight felt pretty solid too, but the extra weight did make it feel a bit more steadier, especially on the two-handed backhands. All right, on to spin. So the spin on all 3 of these paddles also felt really nice, and it was pretty much the same between all 3 paddles. I wouldn't say they generated quite as much spin as the Ruby or some of the full Kevlar paddles out there, but they were still definitely on the higher end for spin. All 3 of these paddles also came really gritty initially, but it's worth noting that they've all worn down a lot already, and I haven't even played with them a really long time. So just off of that, I'm guessing that the longevity of the grit is probably not great, but the KevlaCarbon surface, even without the grit, is still pretty grabby in itself, so there is that. Overall for spin though, I would give these paddles a 7 out of 10. All right, let's go over some of the final thoughts for each of them, starting with the Mark I. I think one of the biggest questions people ask with this paddle specifically is it worth it over something like the Ruby 6.0? And the answer is maybe. While the two share a similar shape and size, they feel and play very differently. The Mark I feels a bit more mute than the Ruby, and also feels a lot more throat heavy, while the Ruby is a bit more top heavy. The swing weight on the Mark I is also a bit higher too, but it also hits harder than the Ruby as well. The Mark I also feels a bit sturdier than the Ruby, while the Ruby feels a bit more hollow. This is really where the two separates as far as pop goes as well. That said, the Ruby also feels a lot more maneuverable than the Mark, so hands battles wise, Ruby is slightly better. And it may not seem like a big deal, but that's probably one of the main reasons I wouldn't be using this as my main paddle. All that aside, it always really just comes down to preference and whatever feels comfortable to you. That being said, the Mark I is also a fair amount cheaper as well, so there's that to keep in mind too. Now onto the Mark OneX. I honestly think this could still be the perfect paddle for tennis players coming into pickleball, as it really does give a similar feel to a tennis racket and makes two-handed backhands more comfortable as well. The only downside is the longer handle also makes things a bit more rattly, but that can also be fixed a bit by adding some lead tape to the throat. Also, I did kind of want to mention that playing with this paddle gives you a bit of a placebo effect that you're using a longer paddle than you actually are. It really makes it feel like you can reach further with volleys just because of the longer handle, even though you can't, but it all comes down to just feel, right? Anyways, the drops and resets are still probably what's holding this paddle back the most, but even then it's still very usable. It's also a very solid mix between power and control, and I definitely still recommend this paddle specifically to ex-tennis players. And lastly, we have the Mark II. Even though the Mark OneX was one of my favorites, I still have to say I absolutely loved playing with the Mark II as well. It is insane how much both power and control you're able to get with this paddle. Drives really did feel easy with this, and drops sometimes felt even better than the Mark I. The only area where it struggled the most was at the net, especially in hands battles, just because it isn't easy to move around, but if you already have fast hands, this could be a good option for you. Overall though, I have to say all three of these paddles are some really solid paddles. While a lot of paddles out there are very heavy towards either power or control, these paddles do a really good job of balancing between both. In that aspect, I'd say all are very solid hybrid paddles. At the same time though, each also leans a bit more into one side or the other, giving you the option to find which one fits best for you. These were also some of the first paddles I've used that I didn't really mind the grip that it came with, as it had a bit softer feel to them, so I have been playing without an overgrip. There were times though when my sweaty hands would make it a bit hard to grip onto though, so I'll probably be adding on some soon. Anyways, on top of all that, these are actually pretty affordable as well. With my discount code DanielPB, they also each come out to $144 before tax, so it's honestly not too bad. The only main con I'd say is the weight on these things are a little unique. They just don't feel weighted like a lot of other common paddles out there, so there's a good chance you won't instantly click with these paddles. It does take some time to get used to, but if you're willing to put in the extra effort and maybe customize it a bit with some lead tape, it could be well worth it. Anyways, that's all I got. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing if any of this was helpful, and I will see you next time. Peace.